They laughed at the farmer's daughter in the boardroom until she revealed their blind spot and walked out as their new chairwoman. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun rose over the sprawling fields of Willow Creek Farm, casting long golden shadows across the weathered barn and farmhouse that had stood for generations. Inside, Sarah Mitchell gathered her interview, documents with trembling hands. Today was the day, her chance to break away from the farming life that had defined her family for generations and step into the corporate world she had studied so hard to enter. Sarah's father leaned against the kitchen door frame, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "You sure about this, honey? Montgomery Industries is as far from this farm as the moon. Those city folks, they don't always understand our kind." Sarah smiled, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "Dad, I didn't graduate top of my class at State to spend my life worrying about crop yields and cattle feed prices. I love this farm, but my dreams are different. This is my chance." Her father nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes despite his reservations. "Your mother would have been proud. Just remember where you came from. That farming knowledge may seem useless to them, but it taught you things they'll never learn in those fancy offices." Sarah embraced her father, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and hard work. "I'll make you proud, Dad. I promise." The Montgomery Industries headquarters towered above the city skyline, its glass facade gleaming like a beacon of power and wealth. Sarah entered the marble lobby, her sensible shoes echoing against the polished floor. Despite her carefully selected business attire, she felt painfully out of place among the sleek professionals who glided through the space with practiced confidence. At the reception desk, a perfectly coiffed woman looked up with a practiced smile. "Sarah Mitchell? 14th floor, conference room C. The committee is expecting you." The elevator ride felt endless. Sarah clutched her portfolio, reciting the carefully prepared answers she had practiced for weeks. This position, junior financial analyst, would be her foothold into a world that had always seemed beyond her reach. Conference room C was intimidating, a long table surrounded by stern-faced executives in impeccable suits. At the head sat Richard, Montgomery himself, the CEO whose family name adorned the building. His steel-gray eyes assessed her coldly as she took the single chair facing the panel. "Miss Mitchell," began a sharp-featured woman, "your resume is unusual, valedictorian at State, impressive. But I see your address is in Willow Creek, the farming community?" Sarah sat up straighter. "Yes, ma'am. I've lived on my family's farm my entire life." A ripple of smirks passed through the panel. Someone whispered something that made another executive chuckle. "And you believe this background qualifies you for a position in our financial division?" asked a balding man, barely concealing his amusement. Sarah felt heat rising to her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "My academic achievements speak for themselves, sir. I graduated with honors in financial economics." "Yes, but this isn't about textbook knowledge," the woman continued. "Our clients expect a certain Polish understanding of their world. How would someone who knows more about crop rotation than stock rotation relate to our high-net-worth clients?" The mockery was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah saw Richard Montgomery watching her intently, gauging her reaction to the thinly veiled condescension. The questions continued, increasingly pointed and dismissive. They asked about her quaint upbringing, made jokes about bringing hay, bales to board meetings. One executive even suggested that perhaps the mailroom would be more suitable for someone of her rustic background. Finally, Richard Montgomery raised his hand, silencing the panel. "Tell me, Miss Mitchell, what would you consider your greatest strength that you bring from your unusual background?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. Time to either crumble or stand her ground. Mr. Montgomery, on a farm, we understand systems in ways that many never will. When you grow up watching how weather patterns affect crop yields, how market fluctuations determine whether your family eats well that year, how a single decision about resource allocation can have consequences lasting seasons, you develop an intuitive understanding of complex, interconnected systems. The room had fallen silent. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. Last year, Montgomery Industries lost nearly $30 million in the Brazilian market because nobody recognized the connection between regional drought patterns and currency fluctuations. I wrote my thesis on exactly this phenomenon. On our farm, we would have seen those signs months in advance because farmers can't afford to miss such connections. Richard Montgomery's expression changed almost imperceptibly. You've studied our quarterly reports. Everyone from the past 5 years, Sarah confirmed. Your company makes brilliant moves in traditional markets, but consistently misreads agricultural impacts on emerging economies. That's a blind spot I don't have. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out several carefully prepared charts. These show the correlation between soil degradation reports in Southeast Asia and your company's recent investments there. I believe you're about to face similar losses to the Brazilian situation unless you reconsider your position. For a long moment, the room remained perfectly still. The executives who had been smirking moments before now looked uncomfortable. Richard Montgomery stood slowly, his gaze never leaving the charts Sarah had presented. Miss Mitchell would, "You mind stepping outside for a moment?" Sarah's heart sank. She had overstepped, been too bold. With as much dignity as she could muster, she gathered her portfolio and walked to the door. 20 excruciating minutes later, the door opened. Richard Montgomery himself stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Miss Mitchell, please, come back in." The atmosphere in the conference room had completely transformed. The executives sat up straighter, their earlier mockery replaced by attentive curiosity. Richard Montgomery returned to his seat and then did something that left Sarah stunned. He inclined his head in a small but unmistakable bow. "Miss Mitchell, or should I say Chairwoman Mitchell of our new Agricultural Markets Division?" Sarah blinked in confusion. I don't understand. Your analysis of our blind spot was not only correct, but potentially saved us from a $50 million mistake. The board and I spoke briefly, and we've decided to create a new division focusing specifically on agricultural impacts on financial markets. It's an area we've clearly neglected, to our detriment. He gestured to the chair at his right, a position of honor. We need someone who understands both worlds, someone who can see connections we've been missing, someone like you. The day morning after her astonishing appointment, Sarah woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of farm life. Her modest apartment in the city felt foreign compared to her childhood bedroom at Willow Creek Farm, but there was comfort in the familiar rhythm of rising with the sun. She stood by her window, watching the city gradually illuminate as the first rays of morning light touched the skyscrapers. The Montgomery Industries Tower stood tallest among them, and today, for the first time, she would enter it not as a hopeful applicant, but as Chairwoman Mitchell. The weight of that title settled on her shoulders as she prepared for the day. Her phone had been inundated with messages since yesterday, congratulations from old classmates who had heard the news, questions from journalists intrigued by the unexpected appointment, and a particularly touching voicemail from her father, his voice thick with emotion despite his attempts to sound casual. "Just checking in," he had said before adding, "I always knew you were meant for more than fence posts and feed bins, Sarah. Your mother would be over the moon." Sarah dressed methodically, choosing a suit that balanced professionalism with comfort. She had resisted the urge to immediately spend her substantial signing bonus on an entirely new wardrobe. "I'm not playing dress-up," she had told herself. "I earned this position by being myself." Still, she did allow herself one indulgence. a pair of elegant leather shoes to replace the sensible but worn pair she had worn to the interview. As she slipped them on, she remembered an old saying her mother had repeated often: "Stand tall in whatever shoes you wear." The security guard at Montgomery Industries greeted her with newfound deference. "Good morning, Chairwoman Mitchell," he said, handing her a newly minted access card that would grant her entry to the executive floors. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt surreal. Just days ago, she had been quaking with nervousness on her way to the 14th floor interview room. Her new office took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city, with distant fields visible on the horizon, a fitting metaphor for her position between two worlds. The space was immaculately furnished with sleek, contemporary pieces, yet felt oddly impersonal. Sarah made a mental note to bring in a few modest touches that would remind her of home. On her desk sat a sealed envelope with Richard Montgomery's personal letterhead. Inside was a handwritten note. "Chairwoman Mitchell, I look forward to seeing how you cultivate this opportunity. Your perspective is already proving invaluable. Montgomery." Alongside it was a small potted plant, not an ornamental office variety, but a seedling cornstalk. The gesture, simultaneously acknowledgement and challenge, brought a smile to her face. Sarah had barely settled into her chair when her new assistant appeared at the door, a sharp-eyed young man named Marcus, who looked both intimidated and intensely curious about his new boss. "Mr. Montgomery has scheduled an executive meeting at 10 a.m. to introduce you to the senior leadership team," he informed her. "Several department heads have already requested meetings to discuss how your division might interface with theirs." He hesitated before adding, "Including Ms. Harrington, who was on your interview panel." Sarah recognized the name immediately, the sharp-featured woman who had been particularly cutting with her rustic background comments. "Schedule her first," Sarah said without hesitation. "And Marcus, could you arrange for some soil samples to be delivered from the Agricultural Research Department? I'd like them on display for these meetings." Marcus's expression betrayed his confusion, but he nodded efficiently. "Of course, Chairwoman." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and orientation. Sarah absorbed information like parched soil takes rain, conscious that she needed to learn quickly. The corporate landscape had its own ecosystem, its own weather patterns, its own seasons of feast and famine. But unlike many newcomers to this environment, she understood systemic thinking, how each element affected others in ways that weren't always immediately apparent. At 10 a.m. sharp, Sarah entered the executive boardroom. All conversation ceased as heads turned toward her. Richard Montgomery rose from his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for her to take the chair to his right. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Chairwoman Sarah Mitchell, who will be heading our newly formed Agricultural Markets Division," Montgomery announced. "Miss Mitchell identified critical oversights in our international market strategy during her interview, and I believe her unique background will provide invaluable insight into markets we've consistently misunderstood." Sarah felt the weight of skeptical gazes. These were seasoned executives, many of whom had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder she had seemingly bypassed in a single bound. Their reservations were palpable. "I know this is an unconventional appointment," she said, addressing the elephant in the room. "And I understand the questions many of you must have. But I believe that innovation happens at the intersection of different worlds. The gaps in Montgomery Industries' market analysis aren't due to lack of intelligence or diligence. They're blind spots that come from having a homogeneous perspective." She opened her portfolio, revealing the charts she had prepared for her interview. These projections show how agricultural cycles affect seemingly unrelated market sectors. It's not information you'd find in traditional financial analysis because it requires understanding systems that most financial experts have never encountered firsthand. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah outlined her vision for the agricultural Markets Division, how it would serve as both a specialized unit for agricultural investments and a cross-functional resource for incorporating agricultural insights into broader market strategies. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knew her subject matter intimately, and gradually the skepticism in the room began to shift toward curiosity. After the meeting, Victoria Harrington approached her. The woman's impeccable appearance remained unchanged, but the condescension in her eyes had been replaced by something more complex. "Chairwoman Mitchell," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Your presentation was enlightening. Perhaps we could discuss how your insights might apply to our European portfolio." Sarah recognized the olive branch for what it was. "I'd be delighted, Ms. Harrington. I've actually been reviewing your European strategy, and I have some thoughts about the potential impact of changing subsidy structures in the EU's agricultural policy." The conversation that followed was the first of many that would gradually transform Sarah's relationship with her colleagues. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to prove herself. Some executives remained coldly professional, clearly waiting for her to fail. Others, however, began to seek her input with increasing frequency as her predictions consistently proved accurate. 3 weeks into her new role, Sarah faced her first major test. A severe drought was threatening crop yields in Argentina, a development that had not yet made headlines but was being closely watched by the farming community. Sarah recognized the potential ripple effects for several of Montgomery Industries' investments in South American markets. "We need to hedge our positions immediately," she told Richard Montgomery during their weekly one-on-one meeting. "This drought will affect not just agricultural commodities but energy prices and currency valuations throughout the region." Montgomery studied her with those piercing gray eyes. "That's a significant move based on weather forecasts, Chairwoman. The data from our traditional sources isn't showing cause for alarm yet. By the time your traditional sources show cause for alarm, the opportunity to act will have passed," Sarah replied. "On the farm, we don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect information. We learn to read the signs and make decisions accordingly." After a long moment, Montgomery nodded. "Proceed with your recommendations. This will be a good test of your division's value proposition." The following week, as the drought began making headlines and markets reacted exactly as Sarah had predicted, Montgomery Industries found itself perfectly positioned to weather the storm. The hedging strategies Sarah had implemented protected the company from losses that struck many of their competitors, while creating opportunities for strategic acquisitions at favorable prices. Word of Sarah's successful prediction spread quickly through the company. Executives who had dismissed her began requesting meetings. Invitations to key strategy sessions multiplied. The transformation of her professional standing was swift and definitive. But the true transformation was happening within Sarah herself. Each day in this new world taught her something valuable about business, about people, about herself. She was learning to translate her farm-grown wisdom into corporate language, creating bridges of understanding where before there had been only dismissal. Simultaneously, she was learning the unwritten rules of corporate culture, the subtle power, dynamics that governed interactions at the highest levels. Sarah was careful, however, not to lose herself in the process. She maintained her habit of rising with the sun. She kept her speech direct and unpretentious. And most importantly, she called her father every Sunday evening, updating him on her week and listening to news from the farm. These conversations kept her grounded, reminding her of who she was and where she came from. 6 weeks into her tenure, Sarah was asked to present her division's findings at the quarterly board meeting, a significant honor for someone so new to the company. The night before the presentation, she stayed late in her office, meticulously reviewing her slides and practicing her delivery. As she worked, she noticed a small gift box that had been placed on her desk. Inside was a jar of soil with a handwritten note from Richard Montgomery. "Never forget that your greatest strength was what others perceived as weakness." Sarah placed the jar prominently on her desk, alongside the now thriving corn seedling. Together, they served as daily reminders of the dual perspective that made her valuable, the ability to see opportunities where others saw only dirt. The board meeting the next day was a defining moment. Sarah stood before the most powerful figures in the company, many of whom had initially viewed her appointment with skepticism, if not outright derision. Now they listened attentively as she outlined how her division had already prevented two major losses and identified several lucrative investment opportunities overlooked by traditional analysis. The Agricultural Markets Division doesn't just focus on farming, she explained. We look at how agricultural patterns affect everything from energy consumption to consumer spending habits. When you understand how fundamentally our economy is tied to the land, you begin to see connections that aren't visible from typical financial perspectives. Her presentation concluded with a series of strategic recommendations that integrated agricultural insights across all of Montgomery Industries' major divisions. The response was unanimous approval, with several board members specifically commending the fresh perspective she had brought to long-standing challenges. As the meeting concluded, Richard Montgomery approached her. "Chairwoman Mitchell," he said, offering that now familiar subtle bow of respect. "You've exceeded even my expectations. The board has approved an expanded budget for your division effective immediately." Sarah felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with corporate success metrics. She had remained true to herself, had refused to be embarrassed by her background, and in doing so had transformed not just her own circumstances, but the way an entire organization thought about the world. 3 months into her role, Sarah's transformation was complete, not because she had become someone new, but because she had fully embraced who she had always been. The farmer's daughter had found her place in the corner office, bringing with her the wisdom of the fields, the patience of the seasons, and the resilience that can only be learned from working the land. When she looked out from her office windows, now she no longer saw an alien landscape of concrete and glass. Instead, she saw fields of opportunity, ready for cultivation by someone who understood both the science and the art of helping things grow. 1 year later, Sarah drove down the familiar dirt road to Willow Creek Farm. Her father waited on the porch, pride evident in his weathered face. "How's my corporate hotshot?" he called as she stepped from her car. Sarah embraced him tightly. "Just a farmer's daughter who happened to find a new field to cultivate." Inside, she spread documents across the kitchen table, plans for a Montgomery Industries initiative to invest in sustainable farming communities across the country, with Willow Creek Farm as its flagship partner. "They're calling it the Mitchell Initiative," she explained, "connecting corporate investment with farming knowledge. The best of both worlds." Her father shook his head in wonder. "All because you stayed true to who you are." Sarah smiled, thinking of the boardroom where she had once been mocked, where now her voice was among the most respected. Sometimes the very thing people use to dismiss you becomes the reason they can't ignore you. As the sun set over the farm, casting the same golden light that had illuminated her departure a year before, Sarah knew she had not just found her place in a new world. She had built a bridge between two worlds that needed each other more than either realized.